Okay, let's get started. Welcome everyone. It's nice weather outside, but the hardcore is here inside for another Hot Politics Lab meeting. And so welcome to all of you. And today it's Graduate Friday, but unfortunately one of the speakers had to cancel last minute, and so there's only one speaker today. Robin Tschötschel. I hope, is that remotely correct? Okay, thank God. For a moment, I realized I hadn't asked you. I hadn't asked you how to pronounce it. And Robin is at the Amsterdam School for Communication Research, doing his PhD on the topic of climate change and or the politics of climate change, supervised by, actually I didn't ask you this, who are your Andreas Schuck, right?
Yeah, Andreas Schuck and Anke Wannenberger.
And Anke Wannenberger, okay, yeah. So we'll give Robin the floor for about 20 minutes, so a bit longer than usual, because we have more time, and then there's plenty of space for questions. So I'm really looking forward to this, and we'll yield the floor to you.
Thank you, Gijs, for introducing me and for giving me the chance to present some of my research here. I'll just share the screen. Right. Okay, and then I need to as well. Let me see. Where is it? Here we are. Okay, yeah. So yeah, I was listening to Cameron talk last week, and he brought up this notion of the tipping point, and I got a bit inspired by this and decided to blatantly steal it from my title. And I think I want to use today to kind of reflect a bit about the past 4 years that I spent studying climate change communication. And I want to offer you an argument in which I say that I think climate change politics and communication, especially in Germany and probably in Europe at large, is moving past the tipping point. And I'll explain in a moment what I mean by this. And you're of course very welcome to try and shoot down that argument at the end. I in fact hope that you do so, and that will likely help me to write a better dissertation in the end, which I will have to hand in October this year. So yeah, what is a tipping point? I think I want to just give a very simple definition here. And that's usually said to be the point where a process of incremental change kind of tilts over into a more dramatic shift or into kind of a runaway process. And I think this rock arch here is a good image to illustrate it, because think of the waves kind of eroding part of this and forming this beautiful arch, but at some point it's gone too far and the whole arch collapses. And of course in the climate system, there's plenty of those tipping points in many of the subsystems. For example, when we think about permafrost, when it gets too warm, the permafrost releases all its methane, and then we will have a feedback loop that kind of leads the climate system to have much faster, much more abrupt changes. I'm not so interested in that today, though, because I'm more talking about what I would call a socio-political tipping point. And in relation to climate change, I want to make the argument that climate change or climate politics has transformed from a niche issue to a more all-encompassing issue. It touches on all kinds of political questions and is debated as such. And I think especially in Germany, as I will try to demonstrate, the public conversation and the political conversation is nowadays much more about how to shape a transition to a carbon neutral economy and society, rather than the back and forth between climate denialism or climate skepticism and those who believe the science, so to say. But I want to take a step back in the beginning and kind of just point out to you a quick overview of those past 4 years. So I started my PhD just a few months after Donald Trump had announced the US would withdraw from the Paris Agreement. It wasn't a happy time to be studying climate change communication. But there were some bright spots also over the years. So the first thing that I did and that got me kind of on this track was to look at public news reporting, and I decided to study widely read online news outlets. And of course, there's a lot of existing literature, but I thought it was a good point to try and do this in a more robust comparative framework. And I looked at statements that were opposed or in favor of key climate and policy questions in those three countries. And what I found is basically this is one first aspect. This is more looking at issue salience. So which questions are being debated, are being talked about. And we already see that in 2017 in Germany as compared to the US, but also Canada, there's a much larger focus on the question whether we need to limit emissions and on so-called efficacy issues. That is questions about which types, in this coding at least, or types of measures could help us achieve emission reduction goals and climate protection goals. And the second thing that I want to point out here is if we zoom in on this limit emissions issue, for example, is that if we look at how are we actually, or how has this been talked about, then we see that in Germany, most of the time that news report on this issue or raise it as part of some article, this is in the form of what I call agreement consensus. So there's only positions portrayed that are in favor of reducing emissions. So that is in around 70%, 75% of all occasions that this subtopic propped up, and only in a minority there's even some form of controversy around this issue. Whereas in the US, it follows a bit more closely what we maybe have in mind when we think about public conversations about climate change, and especially in the US. So this was kind of a first sign for me that these two countries are very different, and that there is maybe a shift, especially in the German public sphere, that needs to be accounted for in how we think about this issue. However, this is very broad stroke research, and I thought, well, it's probably much more interesting to look a bit more closely at who are the actors and who are the people that actually are portrayed in relation to this topic, and also how does this differ between different media. And for this study, I brought in the notion of identity because I had become increasingly interested in the question whether climate change is becoming a part of established political and partisan, especially, identities. And I thought, well, there have been arguments made that this would likely happen at some point or is already happening, but I thought, well, let's do some empirical work. And one of the first things that is maybe important to also keep in mind, and that I noticed heavily, is that well, when we look at media coverage, we are not looking at one public sphere. We are looking at several sub-publics that consume different media. And I think just one way to dissect this is by looking at audience profiles. And here is data from the Reuters Digital News Report. It's from 2019, I think, also. Or 2018, because the study was conducted in 2019. And here the audience is segmented into those leaning to the left, those who identify as center or slightly left and slightly right of center, and those leaning to the right. And then I plot here how many of those mentioned that they consumed outlet X in the last week when the survey was conducted. And in the US, we find there's a large block of outlets, news outlets, that's mainly consumed by people who identify as left-leaning. And those outlets are also very, very few people who identify as right-leaning read those. This includes also video outlets, by the way. Here's a small group of outlets that are consumed by people that identify as either, or so that have a balanced audience profile. And then there's Fox News, And Fox News is basically the only outlet that people who lean to the right consume. One thing that's already interesting here to note is that in Germany, this picture is somewhat different. We also have this left-only block and a balanced block and a right-only block. But these blocks look very different, right? The center block is much more important, and the differences between left and right are much less strong if you just see that the scale goes only up to 20%, whereas in the US it goes up to 30%. So that also gives us an indication what kind of communication environment this issue is being debated in. And then what I did, and you can ask me about a preprint, the paper is currently being reviewed of this paper. Right-leaning outlet in both countries, and try to see, okay, what kind of identities do we see here?
You fell away for like 30 seconds.
Oh, that's long.
Yeah, can you say the last part again?
Right. So I was saying here, what I did is a qualitative study of one outlet in each of these groups. If you want to know more, ask me about the preprint. I can send it to you, because here I will only briefly mention some results before getting to the main study for today. So something that I found here is that the left-leaning outlets, they tend to kind of portray a split or multiple identities on the left that are more or less, or some of them more pro-climate and more radical in their approaches. And in the US, I looked at HuffPost, and they contrasted these progressive and mainstream Democrats, but only basically one coherent group of Republicans, and they're basically all climate deniers. Fox News on the right end of the spectrum kind of does a similar thing, except that now we only have two groups, right? We have the socialist Green New Dealers who want to change the country into a socialist state, and the Republicans who are not so much anti-climate, anti-doing something about climate, but more concerned about protecting the country from the socialist takeover. And in that way, the whole issue has become a very fundamental aspect of these political identities. Interestingly, the centrist outlet also in the US is very different. You see a lot of different positions, especially among the Democrats. This was also during some primary debates. But you also get some Republicans that are critical of the Trump administration, for example. And we have similar patterns in Germany. However, here it's kind of noteworthy that all parties are basically portrayed at that time to be very much in favor of climate protection. This was around the European election or European parliamentary election in 2019, and Fridays for Future movement was big. So it's not quite surprising that everybody wanted to be green at that point. As you have maybe seen on this overview, the Greens doubled their vote share in Germany in that time. Yeah. I'm going to skip a bit the details about the other outlets in Germany, but it basically pointed me towards this idea, okay, we have also in this respect a large rupture between, or large difference between those two countries. And also again, a sign that, well, basically to some extent, all parties are trying to become green, at least in what they're talking about, at least on a surface level. Right, and yeah, some other things happened during that year that then also kind of affirmed this picture. For example, the German government passed a comprehensive climate change law that they now had to overhaul after a constitutional court ruled it wasn't going far enough. Okay, so this is kind of leading up to this study that I want to focus today, or want to focus on today, and this is really about climate change messaging. And you know, as communication scholars, of course, we're interested, how can communication promote individual behavior change, but also emission reducing policy support. These are kind of some of the key outcomes that have been discussed so far. There's other things that are possible. For example, political participation would be interesting, but those were the most prominent ones. And we know a lot about this stuff, in the literature, but most of this research stems from the US or another Anglophone country. And we thought it would be interesting to try this in Germany and see, if we have such a different communication environment, does this still work? And we looked at, especially at the consensus messages and what has been called the gateway belief model, research done by Sander van der Linden, who's now, I think, at Oxford or Cambridge. I always mix those two up. And I'll talk a bit more about this in a second, but we did this using a survey experiment, using a quota sample, which turned out to be highly representative also in aspects that where we didn't set quotas, for example, on political preferences. Not so much to say about the Bayesian stuff, we'll get there. So what is this gateway belief model? Here's already the version that we used, which we extended a bit. But basically it says, well, following some treatment, some information about climate science, about especially the consensus among climate scientists, what will happen is that people first update their perceptions of scientific agreement in the original model, and we added this political agreement to it, because we combined some of the treatments with political cues, and we thought this might then open this alternative path on the bottom. So, once you kind of learn, okay, the scientists agree, then maybe you think, okay, yeah, actually the scientists agree. And there's a kind of a downstream effect. What the research shows, or what this model suggests, is that people update their individual beliefs about climate science. So they say, okay, I now agree more that this is a human-made issue that's bad, and we need to do something about it. And in this case, we really focused on human-made, and it's real, and it will have consequences on humans. And associated is a more effective dimension, this worry about climate change. And in the literature, not on the gateway belief model, but elsewhere, the notion of efficacy beliefs is also quite important. So we decided to include those in our model. And then we have outcomes where we measure intended behavior change and policy support, as mentioned. And I'll talk a bit more about those outcomes in detail, because I think there's some quite interesting findings there. But first I want to look at those treatment effects. And because the model, kind of the way we studied it, we first measure treatment effects, and then we look also at the correlational structure in the second part of the model. And we investigated, well, what if we just, as the original research does, tell people that 97% of all climate scientists agree. What we found is that this has, unfortunately, not really had an effect on our population, at least, on our sample, at least. So here's an estimate, a point estimate of the effect sizes on all those downstream variables, and a basically incredible interval. And we basically say if those lie between the -0.1 and the 0.1 range, then it's too small to be practically meaningful or practically relevant, even though it might be statistically significant. But we're more interested in that. And we found, there might be a very small effect, but we think it's negligible. So then we tried two other conditions where we added in-group and out-group political cues. So politicians from the parties that people in their demographics part of the survey selected as their preferred parties or their opposed parties. And we thought maybe this adds to the effect. There's some previous research on this. But again, while there is a little bit more for the in-group condition, again, they're not really strong overall. So that was a bit disappointing, but also not entirely surprising, given this larger thought that I presented before. What we find, though, for the rest of the model is that it works quite the same way. So if we look at scientific or perceived scientific and political agreement, then perceived scientific agreement is the strongest predictor of downstream variables, both of climate science beliefs and efficacy beliefs. However, this notion of perceived political agreement, it didn't do a thing. It even had these slightly negative effects that are a bit hard to interpret. We can talk more about those if you're interested later. And then also interesting is that as a predictor, perceived scientific agreement doesn't work directly for worry about climate change and the outcomes we have been interested in, but those are mediated by these science beliefs and worry, by these science beliefs and efficacy beliefs. Right. So let's look at those outcomes, those intended behavior change and policy support. And here I'm just going to show you the control group, because I think just as a survey result, this is already quite interesting. Basically, the picture is almost entirely the same for all the treatment conditions. And what we find here is that almost or large parts of the people we surveyed say that they're either very likely or at least to some extent likely to implement some of these behavior changes. Number 5 is reverse coded here. So, for example, we see that people say they're very likely to adopt climate-friendly behaviors. Many say they would want to avoid flying, etc. So there's already very strong public support for all these things. And if we look at policy support, we had 3 subdimensions, and this is carbon pricing, prohibitions or regulations, and subsidies. Again, almost all of these already have somewhat robust majorities, or a majority if we ignore the center column, which is neither nor. So this already shows us that, yeah, it's not so surprising that we don't see strong effects because we're already at a very high level. If we look at what predicts those two as now aggregates or as latent variables, we see again that climate science beliefs and worry about climate change are of course important for both of them. However, if we look at those efficacy aspects, we distinguish between personal, collective, and political efficacy. We see that political efficacy doesn't play a big role for individual behavior, and the other way around, personal efficacy doesn't play a very important role for policy support, which I think is maybe quite important to keep in mind as a takeaway. Yeah, just to zoom out a bit again, I mean, first for this study, as I said, the simple consensus messages are unlikely to have effects. And what we've seen here is that politicization doesn't do much as well. Although this, maybe if we find ways to boost those messages, there has been some research on that, then maybe the in-group conditions could be useful in the future. And I think this really fits into this narrative of a tipping point where basically, the information environment that people are in is already quite saturated with information about climate change, about climate politics. So these like small treatments where we just give people this like sentences to read, or two sentence items, it doesn't really add much to the way they think about this issue. And I think a takeaway is that hopefully, and also my recommendation would be that to really focus on these efficacy questions in the future, both in terms of something to study, but also for communication strategies. And I think it's kind of uplifting actually, because this is maybe a way for the social sciences to find themselves a bit more relevant than they already are, or even more relevant than they already are in relation to this, because a lot of this information about political efficacy is social science-based information. So I think there's a role for us to play in the public conversation about this very important issue. Well, this was the tour de force through 4 years. And I'm very happy to hear your questions and comments already now, or you can write me an email or find me on Twitter. And with this, I hand it back to Bert, I think, right?
Thanks, Robin. This is Excellent, excellent talk, and also really nice visualizations of your results. So big compliments. For those of you who are listening, now you can ask your questions to Robin. You can do this by typing your question in the Q&A box, and then I will read them out loud, and Robin will answer. And while you might be thinking a little bit about your questions and typing them up, I have a first question for you, Robin. Because I really like this idea of thinking about what a meaningful effect size is, right? You had this line in your graph and said, you know, if it's below that, then, you know, I think the effect sizes are too small to really care about them. And at first I thought, yeah, you know, I agree. But then I thought, well, there's another interpretation, and it comes down to your conclusion. We're doing these very stylized experiments here with like a small subtle manipulation. Should we ever expect these subtle manipulations to have big effects on anything? Then you could say, well, that explains why these effects are so small and why we shouldn't care too much about them. But now I bring in something, you know, we work at the same department, so at times we also interact. And you said something at another meeting and said, you know, if we think about repeated exposure to messages, right? A couple of weeks ago, we talked about it as sort of this dripping component. And if you are repeatedly exposed to something, the effects, one thing you could argue is the effects become bigger. So are you not selling yourself short a little bit here by saying in this stylized experiment with this 2-sentence manipulation, I find tiny effects, therefore the results are not so relevant? But if we think about the real world communication environment, could the effects not be a lot bigger if they would be added on top of each other?
Yeah, that's of course important stuff to think about. And I think probably you're right. On the one hand, I would say it is important to note that this consensus messaging, which in the US is kind of has large effect sizes, that it's not this silver bullet that just applies everywhere. So I think finding small effects and having good data that tell us, well, maybe it's not as practically relevant as it is in the US, in Europe, is an important finding on the one hand, but definitely in interpreting this data, I shouldn't extrapolate and say there's nothing good to be said about these either. And of course, there's also additional research that says, well, we can combine these with something like inoculation information that also talks about how misinformation is presented, and then the effects go beyond what the direct effects on these intended behavior change. But definitely, yeah, if we can just like additively add effects over time, then any small effect might be interesting, which I think poses then an interesting problem for research to say, okay, at what point do we consider our findings as something important or not? Like, and when do we interpret it as, oh, there's probably nothing going on, if any small effect might be treated as, oh, over time it will be good. So I think that's probably also something that should be studied in the future more, how these compound effects come about. And probably you have more insights into that.
Well, I was just, you know, in a sense, we're also concerned here first with internal validity, right? So can we detect the effect of interest, and then we then start to think like, how does this work in the real information environment that's much more complex. And that's, the truth to be told, that's where a lot of us, including myself, often stop, right? To say, yeah, you know, we speculate a little bit, but it is something to maybe to think a little bit about in going forward. There's a question from Cameron Brick, who was here last week. Sorry, Cameron, I was on holiday when you presented, but enjoying the bad weather on the campsite. But here we go with a question for Robin. So Cameron has the following question. Very interesting work. Thank you. I'm curious to hear more about how you think about the operationalization of the consensus messages. For example, can we distinguish between whether they worked generalizable, and that they failed here for various reasons, like that they didn't read them, they didn't believe the assertion, etc. I recommend the work by Chester, 2020, Construct Validation of Experimental Manipulations in Social Psychology.
Right. Yeah, in the paper, in the discussion, I talked a little bit about you know, why didn't they work here, and it could be that part of what makes them not work in this experiment, or not work so well in this experiment, is that for example, also in the control condition, people were told that we're now asking them questions about climate change. So all of the respondents were cued into thinking about climate change, versus in the original research that wasn't done. On the other hand, the type of message, the exposure to this like short sentence is the same. That's also the same in the original research. And we have this one reverse coded item, and it seems like people caught that. So it seems like people were generally paying attention. So yeah, there's some factors in the design that speak for we are likely to have found lower effects due to the experimental setup that we had. But there is also a lot of external factors that speak for an interpretation that effects are actually smaller here. And in the end, I think, yeah, that is a bit also up to the reader to make up their mind about. So I'll have a look at what you sent me here. But I would neither read it as something that should be read as a definitive answer, nor as something that's just a failed experiment. I don't think that would be fair.
All right. Gijs, you raised your hand.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. And really, indeed, I agree with Bert. Really nice plots, and I like this the way you discuss your results with the 0.1 intervals. And so I recently did an interview where someone kept on asking me the annoying question, "Can you say a bit more about?" And but I'm just going to do that, throw that in right now, because I wanted to talk a bit more about these 0.1 boundaries. First, could you indicate, so actually what's the scale here, and why did you choose 0.1? Is that a relevant number given the literature? And can you reflect on what this 0.1 means in terms of statistical power?
So just to explain the graph here a bit more. So what we do is this is a standardized effect size, or a standardized regression coefficient, to be precise. So this comes out of our structural equation model, which we run as a Bayesian model. So we get a range of possible effect sizes, or a range of, yeah, basically a statistical distribution of estimates of the effect size. And then what we calculate is a density interval, and where we say, okay, we want to have a 95% level interval. So 95% of those effect size estimates lie within this parameter, and those are the two wings of this estimate. And in that sense, what I did in the paper, what I argued is we interpret this as, well, with a 95% likelihood, the effect is in there. That's how you interpret Bayesian results. And basically, I said, well, if we find that this 95% range is totally within this minus 0.1 to 0.1, then I would treat it as strong evidence of very small or practically insignificant effects, or practically non-relevant effects. If it starts to pop out, then there's a certain likelihood that the actual effect or that that we would find effect sizes further out as well. So I treat it only as weak evidence. So it's a way of transforming a parameter estimate into some kind of a hypothesis testing thinking. And in some sense, this minus 0.1 to 0.1 is arbitrary. It's based on the literature on effect sizes that basically say, well, this is a very small effect size if you would find something like this. So I'm saying if we find something that is very likely or quite certainly so small, then we treat it as practically insignificant. But you could totally say, well, if your 95% credible interval excludes 0, then we should treat it as good evidence for an effect. That's totally a valid interpretation. And in the paper, I also make that explicit that we present those confidence intervals or credible intervals, especially for that reason, for readers to make up their mind themselves about that. Yes, I haven't run this as a frequentist in a frequentist model, but I would expect that, for example, for the in-group conditions, these would pop out as statistically significant if we were to calculate p-values for them. Does that answer the question?
My question C part of ABC was about the statistical power, and
right.
Particularly if you estimate all of this in a single model, as I understand.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have no intuition about what that does to power.
So one thing is, for all of those, you get those credible intervals, and as you increase sample size, those also become smaller. So that gives you an indication of something like statistical power. And I've dug a little bit into this, and I think I should probably do it more. But the notion of statistical power doesn't translate as easily from frequentist thinking to Bayesian thinking.
Yeah.
For example, you don't have the repeat testing problem in the same way, or you don't need to do Bonferroni corrections in the same way, because basically what you say for each of those parameters, you get estimates about where they are likely to lie that are basically your best guess based on the data. So you don't have to think about it in the same way that you have certain assumptions, and part of that assumption is violated when you do multiple things at the same time. Yeah. So far, our reviewers also said this is fine. Nobody commented negatively on this. And I've also found that even in a very small pilot study, the Bayesian analysis, basically it still yielded a solution, which means that you run a model, and if it converges, then you have something to interpret. It had very large intervals, but it still converged. So Bayesian analysis also seems to be more robust to smaller sample sizes in that sense. But that's definitely more methodological reading. I should dig more into.
Yep. Okay. Thanks.
Right. There are 2 questions by Matthijs Roduin. Thank you, Robin. Very interesting. 2 questions for clarification. 1, could you say a bit more about the 3 forms of efficacy? I'm familiar with internal and external efficacy in the domain of politics, but not with these. So let's do this first, Robin. What can you say a bit more about what kind of efficacy beliefs? How do you measure them? What is it exactly?
Just here, for example. So so basically, internal and external efficacy refer to the how we could maybe call it targets, right? So internal efficacy refers to the notion, at least as I understood it so far, and there's also the literature is a bit all over the place in relation to this, that I can actually change my own behavior, or something about me can change. I have the capacity to do that. And then external refers to that my behavior change, my actions will actually have an effect on the thing that I'm thinking about. And what we did here is that we tried to have measures that reflect both of these in relation to these three different domains. So one, the personal life as the closest one, and then the political realm on the other end, and in between something that we called collective. And we basically asked questions for the first one that were about, I feel capable of changing my own behavior in a way that might affect the climate, or in a climate friendly way. It was in German, so it's a bit hard to translate this on the spot. And another one, for example, saying my behavior changes will have an effect on the climate. So this would be the personal efficacy, both internal and external. And in the political realm, it would be my actions. I have the capacity to influence politics, and politics can have an impact on the climate. So in that sense, some people also call the external one response efficacy, and some also distinguish between those. But in essence, we try to have these psychological dimensions in these three different domains. I hope that answers it.
Yep. And Matthijs wants to talk a bit more about the effect sizes. Related to Bert and Gijs's question, I would also expect very small effect sizes when people are not repeatedly exposed to such communication. Why then be so strict to yourself regarding the effects? I would think that in such experiments, weak effects can matter substantively. In particular, of course, when the confidence intervals are small.
I mean, one thing is that, you know, if I want to make an argument that there are no effects and everything is different in Germany than in the US, then I'm actually not strict with myself with putting up this relatively broad range of practically insignificant effects. So you could actually also criticize me for being too quick to dismiss it. And I think that would be just as valid a criticism as saying I'm too strict on myself in saying I'm not finding effects. Again, yeah, I think the gold solution here is really to be nuanced and say, well, on the one hand, we have good evidence saying that these effects are very small, but if you look at just, do we find something that's likely different from zero, then we also have good evidence that yes, that's also the case. So in some sense, yeah, I just don't think it's the most important interpretation here is, oh, it's different from zero, we found something. I think the more important interpretation here is we found something that's likely very, very small. Even though we have good evidence for that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think even though we're all pushing for team small effects here, but you know, given that this is a replication, also we know from replications that the effect sizes generally go by half or so, like on average, right? These social science replication projects suggest like that. So it's also not so surprising that in a sense that you do see that the effects are smaller, and sure, that could be context or your modeling this or your methodological decisions, but most of these replication projects in psychology seem to suggest that, and the social science in general, that the effects become smaller. And I think that is meaningful because maybe I don't know this literature too well, or really not well actually, but that, you know, maybe this consensus messaging has been considered like, well, this is a way we can partly solve a lot of things, and showing that the effects are smaller. And generally, I think we all agree that that giving some bounds, while they might be arbitrary, you can make them smaller or larger, is helpful in thinking about this. And I definitely take this also from your presentation. Given that I have the floor now, I have another question for you, Robin, and that is related to efficacy, because maybe I don't exactly understand what happened, but what's happening, but you seem to conclude that efficacy has stronger correlations with other sort of outcome variables that you consider more downstream in the model, right?
Yeah.
But efficacy itself wasn't manipulated, right?
No.
So while I see it's tempting to conclude that, yeah, there are stronger relationships between efficacy and this other thing afterwards, I would be a bit cautious in drawing that conclusion, because you didn't manipulate the efficacy, and therefore the strength of that association between these subsequent outcome variables and efficacy could also be explained by other unobserved variables that you don't have in your model. So in a sense, would the next step not be to try to get causal control over efficacy and see what that then does to the subsequent outcome variables?
Right. Yeah, totally. I mean, from other research, we know that when people got causal control over efficacy, as you phrase it, then it was found to have effects as well. So that's why I feel a bit confident in saying, well, we should maybe pay more attention to possibly manipulating this variable right away, rather than trying to go through this consensus messaging approach. Which also relates a bit to the point you just mentioned before, that my point here is mainly one about a prominent finding that stems from one cultural context but has been applied in many other cultural contexts, and that we should maybe be cautious with doing that in that sense. But yes, totally. I mean, this is correlational data, right? And especially because we failed to introduce a lot of variation through our experimental manipulations. It's really hard to say how these things relate. So I also wouldn't say that perceived scientific agreement that we treat here as a predictor of efficacy beliefs. I don't see why that should be a causal antecedent to efficacy. Yeah, definitely. Next step, looking at efficacy beliefs. But there is good data that this also works when it's the target variable of the manipulation.
Great. I don't have any more questions. Gijs, do you?
Can you go back to that slide with the dependent variables, with the distributions?
With those, that was here, yes. So this is intended behavior change. Or do you want the political ones?
No, this is. So I was triggered a bit about what you said about ceiling effects.
Right.
Well, I don't think we're quite there yet, but but yeah, I was just thinking. I mean, you started your presentation with with the are we at a tipping point, and I think what characterizes a tipping point is also that the issue itself changes fundamentally because our positions on these issues change, right? And so there will always be a bit of an avant-garde and people who sort of follow. But what the avant-garde is, what is the most the recent adaptations of climate-friendly behavior is, of course, in a way radicalizing quite a bit. I mean, you can call it radicalizing. I just mean to say it is shifting. If I think, for example, in one of my courses, I use this battery of questions from the ISPP, and they ask about climate-friendly behaviors, but it's literally about, do you recycle bottles, I mean, come on, that stuff we did in the 90s already, right? So it's not anything special, but I can see sort of more radical questions that can be asked here. Is, for example, I mean, would you consider stopping eating meat because of climate? Yeah, I'm just interested in what your reflection on that would be, because what's interesting here is this avoid travel by air, that's definitely not a ceiling effect. But I'm not sure what's in these other categories that you show here.
So I would also be very careful in saying ceiling effects stop things from happening. I think a ceiling effect for some might dampen what we can observe, because if you're in the highest category, you can't go into a next higher category, right? And even if you measured this with a slider or something, people would still just move the slider all the way to the right.
Yeah.
And so yeah. So what we tried here is, for example, have this avoid travel by air as with the intention of having one where people also probably more people score lower. So we get more variation in this overall latent construct. But it's actually very interesting here that there's such a large share of people that says they want to try and avoid flying, which, you know, I think if we have an avant-garde of 36%, that's quite big. Yeah. What was your question exactly?
Well, you could rephrase it to should we update these questions into things that make them more that give that are more critical, you know, and therefore create a distribution that is more centered and less
right. Yeah, so I also think questions like, are you likely to adopt more climate-friendly behaviors, is also a non-committal question, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think it's a particularly good question.
Yeah.
However, the intention with this variable was, or with this latent variable overall, was to really measure overall climate-friendly behavior or intended behavior change.
Yeah.
So that's why we chose somewhat, I would call it maybe conservative ones. And I think it would be interesting to try and do that with especially kind of maybe stuff like, it's also tricky. I think the individual behavior change variable is overall not the most important thing to look at. That's the whole other point. So I immediately bounce to, you know, to what extent will you say this will be an important election decision, or would you consider some kind of political activism and then maybe have a battery for that? And there's other research that has done that. So I think those might be more informative. I think if we look at these policy support things, we see that there is maybe, you know, with something, the Germans hate taxes, despite having quite high taxes, or maybe because, I don't know. But still there's majorities for the taxes. So that could be a way out to more precisely ask about, will you support, let's say, policy X, even if it meant that behavior X, Y would get more expensive or something like this.
Yeah.
That I think could be a good way forward.
Yeah.
Or going with some behavior that is a bit more high cost, like, but then it gets tricky because, for example, if you ask about, would you consider installing solar panels on your house, that only applies to so many people, especially in a country where almost everybody is a renter.
Yeah.
So, that's different in the Netherlands, where the owner-occupied share of the housing market is much more important. It could be a thing to do.
Yeah. Okay, thanks a lot, Robin. It's been a great week for climate change.
It's been a very great week.
It got a little bit warmer at the end of the week, but of course, most importantly, the Shell case, where Shell was sentenced to reduce their emissions by 45% by 2030. There are a bunch more also with Exxon and Chevron going on. So it's a great topic, both research-wise and in terms of the politics. Thanks a lot for presenting, and as of course you'll get our environmental friendly hot politics coffee mug. I want to thank you for presenting this, and good luck with getting it published. Let me announce the remainder of the program for this academic year, which is we're getting closer and closer to the end of it. Next week, we have Loes Aldering from the Free University of Amsterdam presenting recent work on leadership traits. And then the week after, that's June 11, I will give a presentation on how to do psychophysiological research in political science. And then 18 June, Bert will give a presentation. And what will be the topic, Bert?
Yeah, it's a good question. The paper I wanted to present is accepted, so I won't present that. I think I'll talk about the work we're doing on the ideological asymmetry. So following the nature of human behavior, the question is, how robust is the association between personality and political preferences in the terms of the self-reported world, and we have some concerns about that. So I'll talk about that.
Okay. Sounds good. And then the 25th, we have a longer meeting, but I think we still need to decide the exact times. But we'll have actually 4 presentations from our interns from the Brain and Cognition Master Program, who are going to run EEG experiments next week in our lab on a range of different topics that relate to political science. So more about specifically about that later. I think that's going to be very exciting. And that will be the end of the year. And obviously, we'll have a new program for you soon for the next academic year. Thanks for now. I think I'm ready for having a beer in the sun, and I hope you can do the same. Okay, see you later.
See you.
Yes.